かがですか? Watanabe Dan desu. On today's episode of Backward Engineering Your Script and Strategizing Your Career, we're going to talk about the elusive four-quadrant movie. Now, what is a four-quadrant movie? This is actually entertainment, fairly new speak, which means that it's a movie that appeals to all four quadrants. And you might ask, what's a quadrant? A quadrant is a segment of the audience. And most of the time, no matter what the movie or TV show, it's always looked at as being based on appealing to a certain segment of the audience first as its primary, and then branching out into the other sectors. And the easiest of the sectors and the most reliable is the four quadrants. And what are the four quadrants? The four quadrants include a gender break, male and female. It also includes an age break, and that age break can vary depending on what the project is. But most of the time, you're going to have an age break between older and younger, somewhere between less than 25 and 25 plus, or 30. Because once you get into the 34 plus, or even more challenging, the 39 plus, you're getting into an audience that becomes increasingly difficult to reach. And not only is the audience difficult to reach, but especially in the world of television advertising, it becomes increasingly more ephemeral and unimportant. Now, we all know that the average television viewer is perilously close to being out of the key demographic period. In fact, this became such a crisis that CBS did its age break as 25 to 55 as being its key, as opposed to 18 to 49. And even then, the median of its audience is right at the very tail end of that, meaning that 50% of the audience is actually older than 55. I mean, let's forget about getting into TV news, where or cable news, where the median age of the youngest of the skewing networks, which is MSNBC, is 65, and the oldest, which is Fox, is 68. I mean, come on, we're talking about a lot of influence being peddled with people who are really technically out of the keys, which is one of the reasons why the advertising seems so canted towards older individuals, because that's who your audience is. But why is there a desire to get younger audiences? Well, first of all, younger audiences tend to have time. And when somebody has time, they're willing to go and watch TV and watch movies a lot. In fact, when we see movies that are massive hits, it's usually because the 18 to 24-year-old audience is going to be the most likely to see that movie multiple times. Older audiences, and I can say this because I've unfortunately become one of them, get to the point where after a certain age, which is usually in your mid-30s, you get to a certain level of maturity and a certain level of I've seen it all, to where it's virtually impossible for a new movie or a TV show to break into your top 10 of all time. It just isn't going to do it, because your other stuff has probably been entrenched since you were before 18. So your viewing habits are set. And yeah, you might be able to add a movie in your top 100, but you're not going to add it in that pantheon. So that's why the age breaks are so important. So by and large, the four quads, and let's just use an example of 25 as the age break, are males under 25, 18 to 24 usually, and males over 25, which and then females under 25, 18 to 24, and females 25 plus. So that is your four quads. Now, there's been a lot of talk about movies being generated for the four quads. This is a bunch of poppycock. There is no such thing. It goes along with unicorns. There is no movie that should seriously be considered as something that appeals to all audiences. And one of the challenges Hollywood has is that it obsesses over trying to create this mythical creature. And because of that, you end up with movies that appeal to no one. In general, every movie or TV show, before it's greenlit, you have a key demographic that you are shooting for. And you usually pick one of the four. You can pick two, but most of the time, you're better off starting with one. What do I mean by that? Let's say you're doing an action adventure movie. You might say, well, this is really a male movie. So, and because it's action adventure and you want people to see it multiple times, it really needs to appeal to that male 18 to 24. Oh, you might wonder why I don't include people under 18, because generally those are people who are relying on financial resources and or living situations to come from someone else. So they're not really fully emancipated. So, okay, let's now that we've gotten that out of the way. So you're going to start with that male 18 to 24. You might actually, if it's something that's a bit legacy, such as a Star Wars, such as a Marvel Universe, say, you know what, we're going to be skewing male. So that means that you actually have a 2-quad movie, that you can have wide appeal between all males, regardless of age. That's the 2-quad. Now, one of the things that has been very distressing when we look at New Hollywood is that this has been ignored. And in fact, you have multiple movies that should have been geared, at the very least, to all males, instead going after a demographic that is tertiary. And you'll notice that in the Star Wars sequels and in a lot of what's going on in the Marvel Universe now, where there's an attempt to make the programming appeal to females. Now, I know that in the boardroom, the conversation is probably we already have males. So we're going to outreach to females so we have a truly 4-quad presentation. And what has happened? All right, you got no female representation relative to an increase over the norm. And instead, you've alienated your males. So that was not a wise move. And yet, Hollywood insists on obsessing about that by that eternal quest for the 4-quad. How else can this be exemplified? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be males and females in an age break. The other thing you might have is you might segment the audience further and say, well, this TV show or this movie is actually appealing more to non-Caucasians than Caucasians. And you go, fine, let's do that, because you know there's a quest for diversity. So let's go for that non-Caucasian market. There's a challenge with that. First of all, in the same way that the Caucasian market, and actually the market as a whole, is segmented between the initial quads, so are the individual different ethnicities. You have a Black ethnicity, quad break. You have a Hispanic Latino, quad break. And you have an Asian, quad break. So you're actually looking at a movie or a TV show that at the very beginning does not have that large an audience. Is this a problem? No, but it means that in order for your project to be a success, you're almost by definition going to have to keep your budget lower. Why? Because you need to appeal to your, at the most, 2 quads in your core audience. So let's go back to the 1970s, because it's much safer to talk about the past than the present, right? So what happened with the blaxploitation movies? Well, those were initially geared toward an urban audience, meaning non-Caucasian. And sure enough, they actually had a wide appeal with that. Surprisingly, for MGM and Warner Brothers, it turned out that because of the time frame, that you actually had a massive crossover audience that allowed those movies to be hugely successful across all demographics. But note the trajectory. It started with its core and branched out. It's the same with any quantity. You start with your core group, and once they give you good word of mouth, or you happen to hit the popular fancy, you'll branch out. Let me give you another example. And I know it's getting old, but almost 20 years ago, when My Big Fat Greek Wedding came out, here you had a movie that was singularly focused on females 35 plus. Wedding in the title pretty much guarantees that you're going to have a female skew audience. Moreover, that audience will probably be older. Why? Okay, here's a fact about Hollywood audiences that the studios refuse to acknowledge, or they keep trying to change, and it ain't changed, but they keep trying it. So you're doing Einstein's definition of insanity, and that is to try to change the core audience from females 35 plus. Since time immemorial, the most loyal moviegoers, and this is regardless of ethnicity, are females 35 plus. This is why in traditional Hollywood, in the studio system, the bread and butter pictures were female star vehicles because they would bring in the audience every week. Your tent poles were the male skew audience. But because you have that initial strength in the females 35 plus, who, okay, admittedly it was in the past, tended to be married. And males, okay, outside of urban areas and outside of certain diverse communities, tended to not really care that much about movies as a whole. Okay, your Martin Scorsese, your Steven Spielbergs, and your George Lucases were always those exceptions, but they weren't the norm. So men tended to go to movies because their significant other wanted to go see it, and they would, you know, like it or whatever, but it wasn't important in the same way that in general, sporting events skew heavily male. That doesn't mean there aren't female sports fans. It does mean that the predominant sports fans are male, and that hasn't changed either. So what would end up happening is you would have your general audience routinely go to close to 50 movies a year. Now that you have most movies geared towards younger males, which are the hardest demographic to get, whether it's TV or feature films, you have ever spiraling costs and ever dwindling returns on investment. This is not smart. But again, this is where you have people looking at their degrees on the wall, looking at how fancy schmancy they are, and saying what I say goes because I'm a genius. I'm Wile E. Coyote, super genius, right? And so even though your financials are shortfalling, you're going to sit there and come up with different excuses. The most ridiculous of the excuses that we see coming out now is, of course, that the audience is at fault, that you got a bunch of racists and sexists who refuse to go see your high quality movie. Okay, do you think that's going to get them to go and see your high quality movie? Or do you think that a certain percentage of the audience goes, F you, I'm not going to go see anything you make? Well, we know the answer to that, don't we? Furthermore, one of the things that's extremely disturbing to me as someone who saw Baywatch, the show I worked on for 11 years, realized in the first season it was done as a first run syndication, this was after its network run, that its primary audience was females 35 plus. That was a shock, especially with Pam Anderson. Didn't matter. The company said, that's our audience, we're going for it. Not only that, this is great news because that means we can get Procter & Gamble ads. It means we can't use the word devil in any of our episode titles. We have to change the title of an episode called Devil's Pool for this exact reason. But there was an understanding that the audience is the audience. You don't try to change it. The problem today is there's an attempt to change the audience. And this is the key to the troubles in Hollywood. Now, we have another issue that's come up, and that is the big disconnect between what something costs and what something can possibly make. And this is exemplified, of course, by Netflix. And I know it sounds like I'm always ragging on Netflix. That's because Netflix is this generation's version of home video. And I came into the industry on the wave of the home video in possibly lucrative sales. And what did that do? It convinced people that your content didn't matter. There was actually a series of articles and sage reports and conferences that were dedicated to the idea that there was a way you could make a movie or a series of movies, a package, because everything was done in packages, where no matter how bad your content was, there was no way you could lose money because this business model was infallible. And it meant that you got most of your money from foreign pre-sales, meaning that you would get money in advance before you shot anything from the foreign market, which would cover anywhere from 50% to 75% of your budget. And in many cases, that secretly meant it covered the whole thing. And that whatever you made in the US would be extra, or perhaps you were going to get funded completely out of home video. But there were very strict budget limitations. For example, something that had to be home video only. You couldn't budget over 1.2 million because no matter what it did, no matter how good it was, because it was only going to come out in home video, you spend more than 1.2 million, you wouldn't make any more on your back end. So yeah, you could spend 2 million, you would still make the same amount, which would mean you would lose money on that film. Now, could you spend much less than 1.2? Yes, you could, but then you would face a different peril. And that meant that your movie would not be compatible with other direct-to-home video titles, which would mean it wouldn't sell. So now you would underperform your expectation, even if it was a pre-sale. And then you would run the risk of your buyers saying, I don't want to buy any more of your movies. And now all of a sudden your whole business model went kaput, which is indeed exactly what happened to that segment. We're seeing the same thing happen with the wonderful world of streaming, that a lot of the business models were based on projections on what streaming would eventually accomplish. And there was this assumption that, like home video, streaming would have an almost 20-year period of almost a perpetual growth and increases in revenues that would allow further artistic expansion. And what's happened instead, as we've seen in the past year and a half to 2 years, that once the competitive streaming systems started coming in, that it wasn't that everyone would have Netflix and HBO Max and Peacock and whatever else is out there. No, what they would do is they would pick one. And moreover, they would switch between those different platforms. And right now, it's way too late in the game to try to go in there and try to mess with that and do something like have a kill fee. Oh, okay, you got to sign a contract to be with Netflix or Disney Plus for a whole year. And if you leave early, you'll get hit with a penalty or something like that. It's too late to do that because you have too much competition already out there. So therefore, it means that the same number of consumers that used to be exclusively Netflix are now split up between all of those other systems. And yet, the spend from each of those companies is if each of them can have what Netflix had in terms of its overall gross in 2018-19. And that ain't happening. In fact, this year, Netflix had a loss in the United States in the past 2 quarters of almost 1 million subscribers net. That's not good. Now you can say, okay, well, Netflix has so many subscribers in the US, this hardly matters. Yeah, it does, because you're spending as if you're on eternal growth. And a lot of your venture capital that's coming in, a lot of the money that's coming in from outside investors and people who are buying your bonds and all that are based on the assumption that you're going to keep on an upward growth and that you can handle your debt. But if your revenues start shortfalling and because the foreign market's certainly not improving the way it was supposed to, and now you can pretty much write off Asia. Asia ain't happening. Even though that's the biggest area of growth, it's still a very small number of subscribers relative to the size of Asia's population. And it ain't gonna become the big behemoth that everyone expected. Everyone's still pretending it will. It's not happening. Anyway, so now you're seeing the beginnings of a cash crunch. And what you've seen is Netflix kind of double down. And there were 2 examples of recent. One of them was the article about Kira Goldberg and Ori Marmer, who are in charge of their feature films. And they said something that was very good. They are making 70 movies next year. That's more than 1 a week, by the way. That's an awful lot. Even during the height of the studio era, the goal was to release 52 movies a year, but very few times did the studios actually achieve that. Because it takes a lot of effort to crank out that many movies. Not only that, that was 52 movies a year of different budget levels. Whereas all of the Netflix stuff, all of the HBO Max stuff, all of the Disney Plus stuff is high end. So you're talking about massive dollars that are being expended for a shrinking size of a total audience. So not only was that article said a lot of good things. And first of all, they said, well, we're going to go back to the model of looking for things that appeal to the 4 quads. Again, there's no such thing. So rather than say, we're going to try to make movies that appeal to very defined segments of the audience and control our spend so that we can achieve maximum profitability. Remember, this stuff is all being written for investors, so it's not meant for the hoi polloi. Instead of saying that, they're again talking unicorns, and especially when they're saying that Netflix is not going to focus that much on theatrical. And we have these articles where Netflix saying, oh, no, we're going to remain a company that's dedicated only to our streaming services. And then in the same article, they point out that they're going to get involved in e-commerce and they're going to do gaming. Okay, contradict yourself 1 paragraph later. And then last week, we had the Net Plus Ultra. And that was the guy who's in charge of Netflix in general, Scott Stuber, have a front page cover girl article in Variety. And this was so outrageous that I felt we needed to take a little bit of a look at it. Now, when I'm seeing this article, I'm thinking, okay, this is a total puff piece. And they keep talking about how Stuber has re-engineered the world of entertainment and how it's a revolution and it's shaking up Hollywood and the movie business is in a revolution. Well, it certainly isn't a revolution because this is the first time ever that the movie business doesn't seem to care how it's going to make back money it invested. Don't you love this photo of Mr. Stuber looking like a giant. I'm like, okay, guys. When I was reading this, I thought Variety has turned totally into Vanity Fair. A thought that didn't get any better when at the end of the articles there's credits for Mr. Stuber's grooming and his clothing and all of that. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. Yeah, that makes a difference. And of course, there's hilarious pictures of him jumping on a trampoline as they're talking about the audience flow. And once again, there is no description of how the money is going to be made back. It's just we're doing deals with Spielberg, we're doing deals with all of these big people, and look at what we're going to be offering in the future. Okay? That's a nice promise. Does that promise relate to anything in reality? Does it tell me how Netflix is going to survive its current pot of debt? No. And once again, we're still talking about audiences and appealing to the artsy side, that movies that couldn't be made before. Well, we just had an article 2 weeks ago saying we're going to drop that we're not going to be spending a ton of money on movies that are outside of the 4 quads. You know what that's actually saying, don't you? I know that none of the articles have a little translation thing in there. It means you're not going to do diversity content. At least not diversity content that's expensive. Why? Who are the gaps in Netflix subscriber base? I'm going to give you all a second to think about that. What group is underrepresented in Netflix's overall subscriber base? You got it, non-Caucasians. Okay, who is all of their material that is supposedly all of this high-end diverse stuff appealing to? You're right, it's appealing to urban Caucasians who consider themselves to be pseudo-leftists. And so it's really not appealing to their core. All we need to do is look at the incredible hatred that was given towards One Day at a Time's reboot by the Hispanic Latino community, loved by the Caucasian community, hated by everyone else. So, okay, that's really working, isn't it? And you know, I look at every single Asian show that's coming out, and it's cringy beyond belief. I mean, I'm expecting to see a remake of Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth next, based on the kind of stuff that's being made about Asia. So it's all cringy all the time, and yet there's this feel of going for that 4 quad. Now, you as a creator, what does this mean for you? It means you got to look at the entertainment industry realistically. What do I mean by that? I mean the old days, which is what every single screenwriting book was based on. When content was king is not necessarily the deal. Now PowerPoint is king. You see that in the overuse of pitch decks. When I was a development exec, we didn't have such a thing as pitch decks, and I didn't even like it when people came in with a presentation that they get to leave behind on. I want to know what your story is. I want to know who your target is. And somewhere between all of that, we can usually come to a creative agreement that's also financially lucrative. Because if you understand what the needs of your company are in terms of its branding and the needs of what the writer is trying to present, maybe it's not going to work for you, but at least you're in the right kind of zone. So because everyone right now is obsessed with 4 quads, I'm going to have to recommend that as a creator, that you have that in mind whenever you write something, especially something that's personal. Now, does that mean it's hopeless to pitch it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Just remember that when you're pitching something that doesn't fit with what the person sitting on the other side of the desk thinks they want, it's your job to convince them why they want it. And if you have a good story and you have even a semblance of knowledge on what the studios are looking for, you can find those kernels in your idea, no matter how uncommercial it might sound, to where it'll be appealing. This was what helped companies like DEG and Island Alive and all of these companies, Orion, that initially had success during the home video era, to really find their niche, have a good return on investment, and keep the doors open, and in fact expand. Now, they expanded too fast, which is why you have your Vestrons doing Platoon and Dirty Dancing being out of business. Orion winning 2 Academy Awards back-to-back for 2 major hits, Dances with Wolves and Silence of the Lambs, and being out of business 2 years later. There's reasons for that. And you can avoid those if you were a producer in a company. It means don't get too big too fast. And we're seeing that Blumhouse has done that perfectly by narrowing in on its niche, which was lower budget horror movies, not going for ridiculous budgets, and keeping things going. I used to think A24 was in that same club, but given their huge desire to be bought out, I figure there's trouble in paradise there. So it's an interesting time to be in the industry. Remember the 4 quads. Remember that you can never have more than 2 of them. So when someone says, oh, but we have to appeal to the 4 quad because everything we do now is 4 quad movie, you are talking to an idiot. That's okay. There's a lot of people who are idiots. Your idea is to say, okay, I'm talking to an idiot. How do I spin my idea so it sounds like a 4 quad based on its 2 quad and then the outreach that comes from it? And it takes a little bit of practice to be able to do that. But remember, it all comes down to storytelling. If you can tell a good story, that's what people respond to, because that's why they love the movies. If you like this video, please hit likes and subscribe. Also, please visit me on Rumble and BitChute, where I do exclusive material that is far more salty than this can be. And we talk about real kind of weird things about Hollywood. I try to do one of those at least once a week or 2. Anyway, look forward to seeing you, and enjoy the movies.
Last night, Howard Beale went on the air and yelled bullshit for 2 minutes, and I can tell you right now that tonight's show will get a 30 share at least. I think we've lucked into something.